Story 2 The Smiling Man by /GourmetCoffee. This is a recovered case file from the district attorney's office detailing the journal entries of one Brian Singer, a 14-year-old boy. The case was closed in 1993, but I was reminded of it when a similar incident occurred recently. I can't prove they're connected, but I hope that I can make others aware of this, and maybe something can be done to save the next victim. August 3rd, 1992. This has been going on for a week now and no one believes me. I don't really do the whole journal thing, but this is freaking me out, and maybe if I write down everything I've seen and show it to the right people, they can help me. There's a man hanging around our house at night, and I don't know what he wants. I'm absolutely terrified that he's going to hurt me. First time I saw him, I had just finished brushing my teeth and putting on my pajamas. I switched off the light in my room, and without the glare on the window, I could see outside to the streetlight across the road. There was a man under it, and he was looking right at me. I couldn't tell from this distance, but it looked like he had a big smile on his face, almost unnaturally big, and it made me really uncomfortable. At first I didn't think anything, it's just a guy on the street. It could have been some creep who watched me change, but I didn't want to tell my family and have them think I'm paranoid, so I just went to bed. The next night when I turned out the light, he was there again, but this time when I saw him he started to walk towards my house. I didn't like him looking at me, so I stepped aside from the window. When I peeked back outside, he was just standing in the middle of the road with that smile on his face, staring at my house. I went to bed, but it took me a long time to fall asleep, and I kept looking out the window nervously. On the third night, the same thing happened, except this time I watched him walk all the way to the sidewalk in front of my house, stand there, staring at me. I decided it was time to tell someone, so I called for my dad. He came into the room, but by the time he got there, the smiling man was gone. Dad told me if I saw him again to let him know. On the fourth day, the smiling man was back again, waiting on the sidewalk out front. I called to my dad, and my dad went outside this time with a bat to look for him. He came back after an hour of looking around the house and neighborhood and told me he didn't see anyone. We live in a pretty quiet neighborhood, so it would be hard for someone to come and go unnoticed. He said he'd talk with the neighbors and see if they'd seen anything. The next night, my dad planned a stakeout with some neighbors, and they all watched out their windows from 9 when I usually go to bed to 11. No one saw the smiling man, and I feel like Dad was beginning to suspect I'm making him up. August 7th, 1992. Dad and the neighbors continued the neighborhood watch for 3 days and the smiling man didn't return. He said maybe all the attention it drew scared him off. I'm just happy the smiling man hasn't been around, and hopefully he's gone for good. I've been having trouble sleeping, and keep having nightmares with the smiling man getting me or being in my house. It would have been a lot better if we caught him. August 8th, 1992. The smiling man was back last night, standing under the streetlight across the street again. Dad really seems mad at me, and maybe I won't tell him unless he starts getting close to the house again. I just want this to be over. August 9th, 1992. He's getting closer again, and last night he was on our side of the road. He was slowly walking closer, so I hid under the windowsill where he couldn't see me and slept there all night. August 10th, 1992. The smiling man was right outside my window last night. I yelled so loud when I woke up and saw him. Dad ran into the room, but he was already gone. Mom called the police and they searched the whole neighborhood and didn't find anything. They put out an alert for him, but I couldn't give a very good description. It's dark and all I could see was that stupid smile of his. I hope the police find him and shoot him. August 11th, 1992. I'm asking my mom to get me shades for my window. Maybe if the smiling man can't see into my room, he will leave me alone. I can't have him there another night. I don't want to sleep in my room anymore. I check the window locks every night before bed, just in case. August 12th, 1992. We put the shades up in the window today. Hopefully the smiling man will realize he can't see me anymore and go find some other kid to terrorize. August 13th, 1992. I kept waking up and staring at the shades through the night. I had the creepiest feeling. The shades glow a little bit from the streetlight outside, so I was watching the glow when a shadow moved in front of the shades. It crossed back and forth a few times. I was really scared, but after a while it didn't come back. I must have watched it for 2 hours or so before I finally got so tired I fell asleep. August 14th, 1992. I woke up late at night and there was no glow on the shades. Something was right outside my window, standing there. I quietly got up and went to tell my dad. Dad was grumpy, but he grabbed the bat and went outside, and I watched him from my room. The shadow was still there for a while, and then as I heard Dad coming, it moved away. Then I saw Dad's shadow cross over it. He circled the house, and came back and he said he didn't see anything. There weren't even footprints in the dirt outside my window. He sat me down and had a long talk with me, and it's pretty obvious he thinks I'm making this up. I don't know what to do. August 17th, 1992. The shadow was back every night. I finally had the courage to peek through the gap around the shades. I saw him up close. I could see his eyes glittering in the faint light and that big smile of his right outside the window. My heart was pounding so hard and my legs were shaking so bad I almost fell over. I sat up in bed watching the shadow on the shades until it fell asleep. I'm scared he's going to break in and no one will be able to get to me in time. August 27th, 1992. This isn't right. I know I can't be seeing what I'm seeing. I can't understand how it's real. The smiling man was in my room. I woke up and he was inside at the far wall opposite my bed. I yelled so loud my dad came bursting into my room, but when he turned the light there was nothing there. My heart was pounding and I didn't know what to say, so I lied. I told him I saw a shadow outside my window again. My dad just lifted the shade and looked outside and then went back to bed angry. I could hear my parents arguing about something from their room, but I'm not sure what. I know my dad thinks I'm making this up. Why would he believe me? How can a man come through a locked window into my room then just disappear? August 23rd, 1992. He was back again, inside my room. I pretended to be asleep and he just stood there watching me. I was so scared he'd know I was awake. My heart was beating so loud and my breathing was so fast. I kept my eyes closed, listening, hoping that if he thinks I'm asleep, he won't hurt me. August 24th, 1992. I barely slept. He was here in my room again. And when he noticed I was awake, he started walking slowly towards me. Every time I closed my eyes, he would stop until I looked at him again. So I just lay there with my eyes squeezed shut until I was so tired I fell asleep. I can't sleep in my room anymore. I'm going to sleep on the couch in the living room. August 30th, 1992. After spending 5 nights on the couch, my parents aren't happy with me. They don't believe me, and they want me to go back to sleeping in my room. Ever since school started, I've hardly slept at all, and I've gotten in trouble at school for falling asleep in class. I don't know why they think I would lie about this, but there's no way I'm going back to my old room. September 6th, 1992. My dad slept in my room for 5 days to prove to me there's nothing to be afraid of, and now he's saying I'll be grounded if I don't sleep in my room. I'm so scared of having to go back in there. September 7th, 1992. My dad pushed me in my room and closed the door on me last night. I tried to sleep, but I was so scared. I woke up after midnight and the smiling man was back, and again he slowly crossed the room. Every time I looked, he got closer, and every time I closed my eyes and ignored him, he stopped, but just lingered there, watching. I pretended to be asleep again, but I could feel his eyes on me. I could hear his slow, quiet breathing faintly over my pounding heart. September 8th, 1992. I got into a huge yelling argument with my dad over having to sleep in my room. He's threatening to have me see a psychiatrist and put me on drugs for being a pathological liar. I don't want to be on drugs. This is really happening. Why wouldn't anyone believe me? I'm so tired. September 9th, 1992. Dad barricaded me in my room with a chair. I was trapped inside with the smiling man. I don't think I slept all night, I just faded in and out of consciousness, but I was always too scared. I would peep through my half-open eyes, and every time the smiling man would see it start coming closer to me. I could see the faint light from the shades glimmering off his teeth and eyes. I can't do this anymore. I'm stealing the kitchen knife and putting it in my bed. This is the last journal entry. When his parents removed the chair from the door the next day to check on Brian, they found him in bed, holding the kitchen knife with both wrists slashed and his sheets soaked in blood. The windows were both locked and there was no sign of intrusion. No footprints, no fingerprints, nothing. Medical examiners confirmed the wounds looked self-inflicted. Psychiatric analysis of the case came to one of 2 conclusions. The smiling man was a hallucination that Brian could no longer live with, or he was a manifestation of Brian's depression. Each time he focused on the depression, it grew bigger and closer, harder to ignore. Each time he ignored it, it stayed exactly how it was. Eventually, Brian couldn't handle his mental illness and took the only way out he knew how. We just got a call recently about a smiling man standing outside the room of a young teen. I can't help but wonder if this is going to happen again. Story 3. The Showers by user/Clover10176. Every area in all parts of the world has those area-specific urban legends that just refuse to die. Whether the stories are about a haunted asylum on the outskirts of the city, a creature that lives in the nearby woods, or a ghost that haunts a lonely stretch of road outside of town, there's always a common thread within the tales. No one has ever been to these places, seen the creatures, or witnessed any hauntings with their own eyes. There are members of every generation who will proclaim that they know someone whose brother's best friend's sister went to that haunted house with 13 floors that used real blood and snakes and spiders and is so scary that no one has ever made it all the way through. those same people will swear by those stories without ever being able to provide a shred of evidence or name of someone who could provide proof of the claims, simply because everyone around here knows it's a true story. The storytellers eventually pass the tales onto their children, who modify them just enough to keep up with changing times, and the cycle continues. I'm just as skeptical as anyone when it comes to these stories, seeing as I was like a junkie when I was younger, constantly searching for more terrifying stories about whatever area of the country I was living in at the time. I made up and spread rumors about haunted pizza parlors in New York, my cousin's encounter with the Jersey Devil, or how my grandfather encountered a feral, human-like demon creature in the woods of Colorado. I even broke one rule with these stories by putting myself in them. This took guts, in hindsight, because I had to make sure that I always told them the same way. Surprisingly, no one ever called my bluff. I like to think that I've had some wonderful contributions to various urban legends around the Midwest and Northeastern states. I moved around a lot. There was always a surge of joy whenever I would wander the halls at school or hear one of my classmates retelling my stories to another one of their friends, adding little bits here and there like a massive game of telephone. I knew, of course, that the stories were complete fiction, but I stood my ground whenever someone asked me about them. I would even manage to act a little bit, speaking with a shaky voice or looking scared when I would recount a situation that I supposedly experienced myself. I suppose this aspect of my childhood has led me to my current predicament, which I will recount in full, for the internet to take from it what they will. I have laid this little introduction out as a sort of disclaimer, aimed particularly at those who will call my story into question. I have been like the boy who cried wolf for years, but I assure you with every ounce of honesty and integrity that I have that this time the wolf is real. From my introduction, it is probably apparent that I moved around the country quite a bit in my middle school and high school years. Neither of my parents had anything to do with any branch of the armed forces. They simply didn't tend to hang around any given place for too long. I suppose it had some sort of effect on me, but I wasn't hurt by it or anything of the sort. Growing up, I was a complete ham. I made friends very easily, and was often the class clown, and because of that, was often disliked by my teachers. Again, this was never an issue, as I was usually in another state by the time the next semester rolled around. My friends were often fleeting, as were any positive relationships that I ever had with my teachers. Because of the events that followed, my memory of one teacher in particular is probably slightly skewed, but I will attempt to give the least biased version of our friendship that I can. Mr. Mays was one of my social studies teachers in the early years of my high school experience. Being older now, I can understand how horrible children are to deal with around that age, and I respect him to no ends for the way he was able to connect with the students. He seemed like one of us. He talked like us, made pop culture references that were current, listened to cool music, and sometimes he would even say hell or damn while he was giving a passionate lecture about Native American history or something like that. A teacher that swore even a little bit was the epitome of cool to a freshman in high school. My memories of Mr. Mays mostly stem from the way that he really got into anything he was doing. The instance that is still very vivid in my mind was, of course, around Halloween of my sophomore year. Mr. Mays had the typical teacher decorations around the classroom, smiling jack-o'-lanterns and black cat cartoons, typical and boring in the minds of egotistic high school students. However, on the 31st of October, when most other teachers were rolling their eyes at the fact that teenagers still took dressing up in costumes on Halloween seriously, Mr. Mays took the whole cool teacher thing to a new level. We walked into the classroom and were surprised to find the blinds drawn, sheets over the smaller windows, and candles lighting the room, and a single frowning jack-o'-lantern sitting on a stool in the front of the desks. Mr. Mays sat at his desk just watching the students come into class and take their seats. He didn't have to ask anyone to be quiet because the moment everyone walked into the room, they were either too excited to care about petty conversations or too confused to bother with them. The students took their seats as Mr. Mays began his lecture. He spoke quietly to set the mood and took a seat on the chair, right next to the jack-o'-lantern in the center of the room. "Today is probably my favorite day of the year, class," he said in a monotonous voice. "Halloween is my favorite holiday, and I want to share with you exactly why I love it so much." One girl raised her hand with a concerned look on the face. "I'm pushing the due date for your papers to next Tuesday," said Mr. Mays, without bothering to look at the girl, who slowly put her hand down, looking around at the other students with a hint of embarrassment. The class erupted into quiet cheers, and Mr. Mays waited for the inevitable silence. He began his story immediately after the class had calmed down. I will attempt to recreate the amazing story that Mr. Mays told the class that day. The way in which he told the story rendered the horror junkies speechless and the rest of the class terrified. The same girl that had raised her hand to ask about the paper was holding her knees to her chest by the end of it with a look of terror on her face. The important thing to know was what the story was about. The specifics slip my mind now and aren't too relevant. I'll try to recount the parts of the story that matter the most, but don't hold me to it. Basically, Mr. Mays and his friends set out on a road trip around the country after graduating from college. They took a truck, loaded it with camping gear, and set out to sightsee for the entire summer. The group went to the Poconos in New Jersey, down to the coasts of Florida, New Orleans to California, and up to Washington. From there, they went to the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, and then back home to New York. This concept of the freedom to travel anywhere had the entire class hooked in an instant. Mr. Mays was the coolest teacher ever, in my eyes. Being adventurous college kids, the group didn't bring a map. There were no time constraints, so they just kind of drove in the general direction that they wanted to go and eventually found a town to stay in or someplace that looked interesting. He told us that after spending a week in Colorado, he and his friends had to travel through miles and miles of corn, plains, and more corn. He assumed that they were either in Nebraska or Kansas when they decided to pool their extra cash and stay in a hotel for a night. They settled in a Motown at some town that Mr. Mays could barely remember the name of when one of his friends realized that they were somewhere near his grandfather's farm. He wasn't entirely sure where it was, but being adventurous college kids, they decided to get a quick refund from the motel and try to contact the friend's grandpa. They were unable to get a hold of the grandpa on the phone, so the group figured it would be fun just to show up. Mr. May's friend was adamant that his grandparents would take them in and feed them without a moment of hesitation. So the group set out with an hour of sunlight seeking the salvation of a comfortable house to stay in. In Kansas or Nebraska, wherever it might have been, there aren't a whole lot of natural markers that could guide lost travelers. Any directions given to someone who didn't live around the area basically amounted to go up a couple of miles to the corn, take a right, go down a dirt road to the other corn, and there should be some wheat on your right. So, as is the case in most scary stories, the group got lost. Never wanting to admit defeat, they drove into the night, making wrong turns every 5 minutes until they found themselves in a wooded road that Mr. May's friend was certain that his grandparents lived off of. Mr. Mays described the road as basically a dark path to hell. I wasn't entirely sure how true this was, because he got very excited and a bit ridiculous with his explanations of the trees that almost tried to grab the car, and the red eyes of countless animals looking at them from the darkness. Regardless, the typical horror trope worked on most of the class. Everyone was terrified. So the group of boys drove on this dark road for about 15 minutes before they came to a clearing in a small building with lights in it, and what seemed to be a silo. They figured that, at the very least, the people who lived there would be able to help them find where the guy's grandparents lived. The whole idea of everyone knows everyone in these hick parts of the country fueled this hope. They pulled the car up near the building, realizing when they were out of the car that it appeared to be like kind of places where one would store a bunch of chickens, not a home. Still, the lights were on, so they figured they would give it a try. They approached the building as a group, looking in a semi-open sliding door to find a big empty room. Hanging fluorescent lights lit the room like it was daytime, and they couldn't see a soul. There were no cars, but one of Mr. Mays' friends was convinced that he'd seen someone as they pulled up, so they decided to go inside to see if there was an office or something where someone still might be working. Why else would they have this huge place lit up like that? There were no doors inside the building. Again, it was just a giant empty hall. So the group roamed around the property over towards the silo. As they got closer, they noticed what appeared to be a cellar door. At this point, I remember Mr. Mays telling the entire class to learn from his idiocy. He told us that he hadn't seen many horror movies before that time, and didn't think twice about approaching a creepy cellar door in the middle of a dark, scary foreign place. He said that approaching the door was one of his biggest regrets. Mr. Mays let the whole class know that he was going to tell us as much as he deemed appropriate about the experience. He felt that we were mature enough to handle it, but advised anyone that was squeamish to leave the class early. Several students quietly gathered their things and walked out of the door, and a couple of them being stoners who saw this as an opportunity to smoke behind the school before the next class. I didn't even give the announcement a second thought. Like I said, I was and am a sucker for this kind of stuff, and Mr. Mays was telling the story better than anything I'd ever conjured up. I wanted to learn from this guy, even though I didn't believe much of the story. After the class thinned a bit, Mr. Mays continued with the story. He told the remaining few that he and his friends opened that cellar door, releasing a smell that he only described as the most putrid thing my senses had ever experienced. The group was no longer concerned with finding the owners of the property, but was now set on finding the source of that smell. They went down the steps into the cellar, which was lit by single bulbs placed sporadically along the ceiling of a long hallway. No one spoke, and things had gotten too strange. The walls were lined with metal sheeting, similar to the roofing on farms. The hallway itself was crooked, and the ceilings constantly lowered and rose, like a tunnel that was hastily dug but never touched up. There were sections where the boys almost had to crouch in order to pass. The worst part, Mr. Mays told us, was that the light bulbs continuously flickered, sometimes acting like a strobe light, making it very difficult to move through the winding and unstable hallways. In hindsight, he was certain that his mind was playing tricks on him, but he remembered seeing flashes of things that couldn't be there. He said that when you are that focused on something, or if you're that nervous, your mind can do that to you. It can simply revolt. showing you things or people that aren't there. He continued to describe the hallway, and I was on the edge of my seat. The halls were windy and seemed to go on forever. Mr. Mays guessed that they were somewhere under the creepy forest they had driven through when they found a door, but he couldn't be sure. He said that they came upon a door after walking for what felt like a mile. It was simple and wooden, but it looked like it belonged outside of a suburban home. It had a nice design, seemed to be freshly painted red, had a very nice knob and knocker on it. It was a door that belongs at the entrance to a nice house, not one that would be sitting in a dirt tunnel in the middle of nowhere. His friend walked towards the door, moving carefully because of the flashing bulb and increasingly uncertainty about the stability of the surrounding walls. He turned to the group, the rest of which were nervous and at the very least attempted to lighten the mood with a laugh before he said, "I should probably knock first." Mr. Mays' friend grabbed the steel knocker and hit against the door several times, mockingly but quietly uttering, "Is anyone home?" The group waited about 30 seconds before the tension broke. The guy next to the door shrugged his shoulders and went back to his friends, but as he did, the light bulb between them surged and exploded. The boys shielded their eyes, and one of the metal sheets of the makeshift roof dropped. The edge of the sheet fell directly on the boy's forehead, slicing it open, sending a wave of blood down his face. The impact apparently knocked him out, and he fell back against the door, knocking it open in the process. The entirety of the group rushed through the dim light to their friend, barely noticing the seemingly pitch-black room that now lay before them. Mr. Mays was the first to make it to his friend's side, lifted the guy's head into his arms, immediately taking off his jacket and putting it over his forehead to attempt to stop the bleeding. Once the group had calmed down, Mr. Mays noticed that the arm that had been bracing his friend's head was soaking wet. He was confused about this and was attempting to sort it out when one of his friends started talking. He said something along the lines of, "The lights, we have to go," when Mr. Mays took notice. "You know when you turn off a light," he told the class, "and everything is almost pitch black except for the light of the bulb dying out or cooling down? It was like that, but there were so many of them. At least 20 bulbs had lit the room seconds ago, and now it only looked like little stars in the darkness. It was definitely terrifying, but it wasn't the scariest thing. There was still a very dim light coming from the hallway behind them, and though it was weak, it lit up the room just enough to see the shape of tens of people standing less than 10 feet from them." Mr. Mays' friend went to say something else as one of the bulbs in the right flickered to life. Let me interrupt at this point and say Mr. Mays was always a generally playful guy. He had that tone of voice that makes you want to respond. Basically, he could say, "Let's go jump off a cliff, guys," and you would want to respond with, "Alright, Mr. Mays, show us the way." That is a ridiculous statement, but it gets the point across. He was a charismatic guy. The whole story up to this point had been told like a campfire story. He had the voice inflections of someone attempting to be mysterious and scary, which worked, but it was noticeable. At this point in the tale, I recall that changing completely. He was no longer attempting to spook anyone. I could tell that this section was difficult for him. Either he was a very good actor, or it was a really terrifying memory for him to relive. He told us that the light bulb came to life and illuminated the group of people in front of him. In the dim light, he could see children, at least 20 of them in the visible light. They were all dressed in nightgowns that looked to be tattered and torn, stained dark with something. Their hair was long, and every single one of them looked like they had not had a haircut since birth. Even some of the children were completely obscured by the length of it. Every single one of them didn't appear to have seen a shower or nice bath in their entire life. Mr. Mays told us the most terrifying part of the whole thing was that none of the children were moving. They were all standing, staring, most of them only visible from the faint light that reflected off their eyes. This whole group was paralyzed with fear for several seconds when they heard what sounded like an animal in the distance yelping. The way it was described was like the sound of a dog crying multiplied by 10. This spurred the group to life just as the children began to step forward. His group grabbed the injured one and lifted him out of the room into the hallway in an instant. Mr. Mays took another second to move and had difficulty finding his bearings. He reached to his left in an attempt to find a wall to lean against, and he ended up finding a handle and then pulled hard, never losing his vision on the children. He bolted for the door right as he noticed what he had grabbed onto. A shower head protruded from the cement wall, reaching maybe a foot into the room. There was something leaking from it, but it was too dim to tell what it was. He realized it had been leaking onto him, but he didn't care. There were now children stammering towards them as an animal cried in the distance, and his friend was seriously injured. As he left the room, he made a point to emphasize that he could make out several more shower heads on the wall near the single dim light bulb. "This is why I called them the showers," Mr. May told the class. I was transfixed, sitting as far forward as my desk would allow, bracing for more. "I slammed the red door behind me," he said, "and ran through that hallway faster than I've ever run before or since. I made it back to the car and we drove out of there like a bat out of hell." A couple of students snickered at his use of the word hell. "So, when you're out trick-or-treating tonight, Make sure that you know exactly where you're headed, and don't go out to any abandoned farmhouses. I mean, there aren't many around here, but you're all smart kids. Except Jerry. The class laughed and the mood lightened as the bell rang for passing period. Mr. Mays turned on the light and thanked everyone for listening, reminded them about the paper due next week, and told us to have a safe and happy Halloween. The students all around me were abuzz with theories about the story they had just heard. I bet it was some sort of crazy Nazi hideout, said one girl. I think they were all ghost babies that were killed by a dog, said another. I couldn't theorize in the slightest. I was still caught up in the moment. The way that Mr. Mays had told that story and the detail that he included in it left me feeling like we didn't get the whole story. A couple of days later, I stayed after class and asked him about how it really ended and what happened to his friend. He laughed and said that his friend was fine and that was honestly, he whispered this part, probably due to some of the drugs they were on at the time. Mr. Mays winked at me as if to say, "Don't tell anyone about the drugs bit, kid," and I smiled and left. I lived in that town for another couple months and then was rapidly moved halfway across the country to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. I twisted the story around and told it around campfires as I got older, and it was always a hit, but I always changed the ending, letting the friend die of blood loss or from being dragged away by children. It wasn't until college that I got a chance to talk to Mr. Mays again. I went to college in northern New York, not for any reasons associated with this story. College was a fun time for me. I continued being the same ham that I had always been. It wasn't until sometime around my junior year that I ran into Mr. Mays at a bar that I frequented. Initially, I couldn't be sure that the person I saw laying with his head buried in his arm at the bar was Mr. Mays. The only trait that grabbed my attention was a sweater that he used to wear on his birthday during class. The shirt simply read, "I'm the birthday boy." I told my group of friends at the table that I would join them in a second and walked over to the man at the bar. "Mr. Mays?" I said, and the man looked up. The man took a second to look at my face before he smiled, put a hand on my shoulder, and said, "Hey there, son, how have you been?" I could smell some strong whiskey on his breath, and his cheeks were flushed. The look in his eyes told me that he was 3 sheets to the wind and probably had no idea who I was. "Mr. Mays, it's Jack. I was a student of yours for a couple semesters about 6 or so years ago." His face changed a bit and a genuine look of recognition set in. He took on a calmer tone, smiled, and said, "How have you been, Jack?" He talked for a solid 20 minutes. I told him what I had been doing for the last several years, and he told me. Apparently he was still teaching at the same school doing the same old shtick, as he called it. I asked if everything was alright, and he said that they were as good as they ever have been or were ever going to get. It took me a while to realize that I was an adult that was having a conversation with another adult. Every time I had spoken to Mr. Mays previously, I had been in the student-teacher relationship, but now, I was just a guy having a drink with a friend at the bar. My friends eventually left, and I continued to drink with Mr. Mays. He told me all about his divorce and his kids, the things I never would have asked or cared about previously, but now, I cared. He was a real person to me, not just an idol anymore. This was a guy who had real problems, not the infallible teacher that I once thought he was. It had been several hours before I even brought up his story about the showers. I told him all about my history with urban legends and scary stories, and he just laughed. I mentioned the story that he had told us years ago, and he almost seemed uncomfortable. He finished his whiskey, signaled for another, and then turned to me and got very serious. "Listen, Jack, I don't know why I kept telling that story year after year." His words were slurred, or my hearing was messed up. We were both sufficiently blitzed at this point. That was what my therapist told me to do when I was younger. I had to tell people it to come to grips with it or some He took a big swig of his drink. "Wait, your therapist?" I said. Mr. Mays laughed heartily and looked at me. "Of course, Jack. You think that something like that wouldn't hook a person up?" I was confused, but smiled nonetheless. Things had just gotten very strange. "But, I mean, you said you were all on drugs or something, right? No one was too terribly hurt. You were all okay, right?" He almost got cartoonish with his sadness in the next several seconds. "Of course we didn't, Jack. Why do you think I'm here right now?" I was puzzled, quickly filled with 1,000 questions I wanted to ask him, but I let him carry on. "Tim, you didn't make it, Jack." He laughed. His laugh turned suddenly to tears. "King took him, they did. I don't even know. Cops told us we were just drunk, and then he wandered off and got taken by the wildlife. He didn't know. He didn't see it, Jack." I was absolutely stone-faced at this point. Mr. Mays was carrying along like I knew the actual story, but didn't. His friend disappeared. I didn't know. "I wish they'd have found the body, though. Then we could have shown them." He sighed. "That's a bad place, Jack. I don't know anything else to say. It's a bad place." Carried on for a couple minutes more about his friend and the fun they had, just before they went on that trip, and I let him talk. It was only a few minutes later that his phone rang. "Hello, sweetheart," he whispered into the phone. "I'll be out in a second. He gagged. "Of you, baby." The person on the other end hung up the phone. Mr. Mays got up to leave. "It's been nice seeing you, Jackie. Got a good head on your shoulders, boy. Make sure you use it." He began to walk out of the bar. "Mr. Mays," I yelled after him. "Yeah, Jack?" He turned towards me. "Where'd you say all that showers business took place?" "Where? Hell, I didn't mention it. Somewhere outside of Broken Bow, Nebraska. Getting hell on earth, if you ask me." Mr. Mays walked out of the bar after waving to me, running into the wall before eventually finding the door. That was the last time I would see him. I'd never be able to tell him the impact that he had on my life, or rather, the impact that his story had on me. He'd never know about the trip we took after graduation, almost mimicking the one he and his friends had made. He would never know that the things he saw at that place were real. Why? Well, he died about a month later. His liver failed on him. It's alright though, because his family was with him in the hospital room. He got to die around people that cared about him, and that is all I can ask for a man like that. I experienced that place too, several years later. That is where my story turns. The following is the story about how I came to find the showers, and why I will never, ever go anywhere near Nebraska ever again. I'll finish this story when I'm sober. The memory is clear though. I'm awake now, semi-sober, and ready to finish this for you guys, the internet, and whoever cares to hear it. I didn't find out that Mr. Mays had passed away until a couple months after the funeral service. Initially, I was going to seek out his family in order to send my condolences, but it wasn't as if Mr. Mays and I were best friends or anything like that, so I refrained. I continued through my college career and graduated a year or so after our bar meeting. Graduating with English as my major wasn't a mistake, but it wasn't exactly something that landed me any sort of immediate jobs after college. Now, I had saved a pretty solid amount of money while I was in school and decided that I deserved a bit of vacation, if you will. I took my spare cash, got together with my college buddy Steve, and packed it up and hit the road, aiming for somewhere in the Rocky Mountains. I had lived near Littleton, Colorado when I was younger, and remembered loving the area, so this destination was as good as any. The trip was a success. We made it somewhere around Estes Park, Colorado, and found a cheap cabin that we rented for about a month. The days were filled with lounging, hiking, and generally things that involved little to no work on our parts. After our rental was through though, we packed up and headed again on our way back east. Sometime during this trip, we had met up with a couple of Estes Park natives in one of the local bars. We never typically hung out with any of them or anything like that. We just had conversations now and then over drinks and food. One night, these guys were paying their tab and packing up to leave awfully early. They were usually there until the wee hours in the morning. When we questioned them about it, they told us that they were headed to a little get-together with some friends of theirs, and they invited us. Having nothing else to do, we hopped in the car and followed them to the party. The party itself was very low-key, ultimately inconsequential to the story. However, the important thing about it was at some point in the night, we were all sitting around the campfire swapping ghost stories. At this point in my life, I wasn't as much of a ham as I was in my younger years, but with a little bit of encouragement, I started on a couple stories that I remembered telling in my youth. Eventually, I made it to Mr. Mays' story about the showers. Every time that I had told it after hearing it from Mr. Mays, I had spiced it up a little bit. But out of some sort of subconscious respect for my former teacher, I went straight into the version that he told my class in my sophomore year of high school. The group enjoyed my stories for the most part, the showers being the mutual favorite among partygoers. Steve and I left for the cabin at around 5 in the morning, and he asked me about that story on the drive home. I told him all about Mr. Mays, that class, my love for everything horror related and whatnot, and he suggested that we tried to find the place on our return trip to New York. Initially, I was reluctant simply because I didn't feel like aimlessly wandering through Nebraska for days, looking for some old farm building that was probably demolished at this point. But a couple of days before we left Colorado, I told Steve that it sounded like fun. We weren't going to be able to do another trip like this for a long time, so I figured that we might as well make the best of it. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I thought of it as a little tribute to Mr. Mays, a guy that, in retrospect, helped me realize that I wanted to be a writer. Anyway, we left Colorado and made the long, boring, and barren drive to Broken Bow, Nebraska, or hell on earth, as Mr. Mays had put it. We found a motel in town and hung around for a couple of days, venturing out 100 miles or so in any given direction each day after that. I had remembered Mr. Mays telling us that it was somewhere outside of Broken Bow, but I don't think he got any more specific than that. We tried asking townsfolk if they had any information about the showers, but we were usually met with blank stares or eye rolling when we told them exactly where this place was. The only person who seemed to know anything about it was an older lady that worked at the gas station on the outskirts of town. I don't recall her name, but this woman was just one of those cheerful old people, very helpful and generally interested in what anyone had to say to her. Steve had started talking to her at the checkout, and she asked about our license plate, commenting about the fact that we were very far from home. We had nowhere in particular to be, so Steve and I ended up talking to this woman for about 15 minutes, at which point we brought up our hunt for the place known as the Showers. Initially, the name didn't ring any bells with the woman, which made sense seeing as Mr. Mays had just given it the name after his experience there. But when I began to describe the details I remembered from his story, the friendly old woman interrupted me. Her tone was not scornful or mean in any way, but she became very terse and deliberate with her words from that point on. People don't deal with anything relating to that sort of business around here anymore, she told us. That was all a long time ago. Following her statements, she attempted to be cheerful again, excusing herself to the restroom, and wishing us the best on our return trip to New York. Steve and I returned to the car without a word. Both of us were thinking about what the lady had said. Again, she didn't seem to be angry at all, she just didn't want to hear another word about it. We were driving back to the hotel before Steve said something. I mean, if I had to live in a place associated with an urban legend or something like that, I would totally mess with anyone who asked about it, he said. I mean, eventually you just get tired of people asking about it, so you just try to scare them to get them to shut up, wouldn't you? I agreed with Steve and kept driving, but the whole experience wasn't sitting right with me. If this was some sort of well-known legend at the time, why did no one else in town seem to know anything about it? But I managed to shrug it off. Mind you, neither of us was scared of finding the Showers. This little excursion on our trip was more like a scavenger hunt, a cap-off to an overall relaxing vacation. Steve and I were basically like tourists, hunting for the site at which a famous movie was filmed or something like that. We went into the whole situation with little to no expectations and a fleeting hope that we would be able to find this place. We spent another day in Broken Bow before we took our next trip out to try and find the Showers. Nebraska isn't as terrible a place as people make it sound to be, but it isn't really all that exciting. We found a bar and spent some time there, and it was just about the extent of our activity on our day off. When we did get back on the road, we decided that we would attempt to stay off the main roads for as much of the day as we could. I knew that there was no way this place was going to be off on the highway, and I remembered some detail about a dirt road in Mr. May's story, so we went looking for those. This was a fairly futile effort. Most of Nebraska is dirt roads. It was 7 in the evening when we came upon a small but thick forest. I use the term lightly, but for Nebraska, this place was like an oasis. The trees were full and thick, shrouding most of its insides with darkness. The sun was setting, and even though we had run into a few of these random crops of trees, we agreed that this one showed more promise than any of the others. There wasn't really a road, but there looked to be a path where a dirt road might have been at some point, so we drove along that. If the car was able to handle the Rocky Mountains, a dirt path in Nebraska would give us no trouble. We moved slowly and carefully along this trail, making sure to clear any fallen trees in the road or rocks that would render the car useless when the sun finished setting. It was pretty dark in this place during the day, but when night came, it was something else entirely. I had an inkling at this point that we had found the right place, but didn't want to jinx it, so we continued onward. I didn't realize at the time, but little bits of light that managed to penetrate the canopy in this miniature forest actually did make it look as if the tree branches were trying to grab the car, just like Mr. Mays had said. I'm still convinced that he made up the part about the animal eyes though. The most aggressive creature we saw in the woods was a dead rabbit on the side of the trail. It didn't have any obvious signs of death, it just looked like it had simply laid down and never bothered to get up. We drove around in the darkness for quite a while before we found a clearing. We had to move several smaller clusters of branches out of the way before, but right in front of our exit was a giant dead monster of a tree. There was no way we were moving this one, so we got out and turned on the bright headlights in the hopes that it would illuminate the area in front of us. There was a feeling of excitement mixed strangely with fear when I saw what lay 50 feet beyond the clearing. There, partially lit by the headlights from the car and a little bit of light from the crescent moon, was what appeared to be an old barn house. This wasn't a typical farmhouse. It was larger than the barns I had seen in films and didn't have any sort of crest. It basically looked like a small warehouse. I wasn't entirely sure at this point if this was the place we were looking for, but this was definitely the closest we had come. I moved through the brush until I was roughly 20 feet from the entrance, at which point all the growth seemed to stop. I don't know if the owners had done something to the soil, but the whole structure had a border around it that was clear of any sort of plant life. I approached the entrance to the building, a large sliding door, as Steve came up behind me with 2 flashlights in hand. "So you were just gonna run off into that place in the dark?" He laughed. I gave a half-hearted chuckle and grabbed one of the lights from his hand. Mine was a little but pretty bright flashlight. It was the kind that hikers would most likely fasten to their backpacks just in case they were stranded at night. It worked well enough. I grabbed the metal door with both hands, holding the flashlight in my mouth, and gave it a tug. It moved slightly, creaked a little bit, but there was no way I was doing this by myself. Steve came up behind me and set his flashlight on the ground, grabbed the door, and said, 1, 2, 3. We pulled out the door with all we could muster. Once we had managed to move back a couple of inches, it must have lashed back onto its track because it slid very easily, stopping hard with a loud, echoing thud when it was completely open. Steve picked up his flashlight and walked behind me. I had already moved inside. The inside of the structure was exceptionally bare, almost troublingly so. I wasn't entirely sure how far we were from the nearest home or small town, but there wasn't even the slightest bit of evidence that anyone had been in this building for years. There were no broken beer bottles or empty bags of chips. There weren't even any animal droppings or eager plants that managed to grow here. The room was expansive, larger than your average farm, but not the warehouse-sized monstrosity that I believe Mr. Mays had described in his story. I was sure that it was simply a holding area for farming equipment or something similar at some point. Disappointed, I wandered near the entrance while Steve ventured into the expansive darkness. As I was running over the details of the story in my mind, something struck me like a sack of bricks. In Mr. Mays' story, there was a silo near the barn. I ran outside, my eyes adjusting easily because at the very least it was brighter outside. I looked in all directions, running around the perimeter of the building. Surely, if there was ever a silo near this place, there would be some evidence of it somewhere. But despite my hopes, there was nothing but a cluster of thick bushes on one side, brush and dirt everywhere, and the forest that we had come from. I walked back into the building, frustrated and tired. Steve was still excited, eagerly running around the inside of the building. Even if I could just find a shower head or a pipe, he said, then we'd know it was true. Just keep looking with me. I didn't want to ruin his excitement. I had told Steve the story several times, but obviously he didn't realize this wasn't the place. The building was weird, yes. It was out of place and oddly pristine, but it wasn't the location of the showers. I let him explore for a little bit before I called him over. This was probably as close as we were going to get, man, I said. But this isn't it. Remember the silo? His face went from excitement to disappointment in an instant, much like a young child who didn't get the presents he wanted on his birthday. I patted them on the shoulder. This is still pretty cool, though. I mean, we could still tell people that we found it. I was reverting back to my old habits quickly. Steve laughed. Yeah, man, I guess we could. It is definitely creepy enough. We should get some pictures as proof, you know? I agreed with him. I'm gonna go grab the camera really quick, he said as he bolted out of the entrance of the building. I was left alone in the building. It was very quiet when I was alone in there. I could hear the faint sound of Steve running through the brush to the car. But once he was far enough away, everything was quiet. I remember not even hearing the wind or the chirping of crickets as I walked deeper into the dark, flashlight in hand. I was convinced that there had to be something. As I approached the far corner of the room, the sound of my feet scratching against the dirt was interrupted by a soft, hollow thud. I stopped, trying to figure out what it was. I put my foot down hard against the ground and heard it again. I stomped one more time, realizing that the floor I was standing on was covering something hollow. I walked to the wall of the room, looking carefully at the floor to try and spot any holes or gaps. As far as I had known, it was solid ground that this thing sat atop, so I was convinced that I had found a hatch or basement or something. I heard Steve coming back through the brush as I shouted, "Steve, come over here, it's hot." As I went to say the word hollow, I hopped a little bit, hoping to recreate the sound so that he would be able to hear it upon entering the door. The second that my feet made contact with the floor, I felt it give out beneath me. The memory of the fall is fuzzy, but I do recall hearing wood splinter. I remember seeing the light from Steve's flashlight falling away into complete darkness. It wasn't a long fall, but I must have fallen in a terrible position, because I know that I lost consciousness for several seconds at least. When I woke up, I was staring at a bright light. For an instant, I had thoughts about approaching the fabled light at the end of the tunnel. I was angry at myself. You died in Nebraska, Jack? Wow, you sure do know how to get up. When I woke up, I was staring at a bright light. My self-deprecation in the afterlife was interrupted by what sounded like Steve's voice. Jack, can you hear me? Dude, wake up, please wake up, he screamed. I managed to lift my head off the floor just enough for him to celebrate. The pain in my head was immense, but it was outweighed by the pain shooting through my knee. I knew I had a concussion, but the pain in my knee was just so much more pressing. I looked around until I found my tiny flashlight, and sat up and reassured Steve. I'm okay, I just hurt my knee. Bumped my head too, really hard. Thank fuck, man. I thought you were dead. Imagine that though, dying in Nebraska. It'd be awful. His words made me laugh a little bit, but I stopped myself. The slightest shaking hurt my head and made me incredibly dizzy. I guess a rope? Said Steve. What? I asked quietly. Should I go get a rope to get you out of here, or do you see a ladder? I looked around the walls that sat in front of me. There was smooth cement. There was no way I was climbing out of there. Yeah, get the rope, I told him. It's buried under all of our stuff, but I think it might be in my red climbing bag, I'm not sure. Steve nodded, telling me to hang in there and that he would be back in a little bit, and he ran off. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. After the sounds of Steve's feet scraping the floor above me faded away, I was only able to hear that buzzing that occurs in total silence, intertwined with the pulsing in my head. I pushed myself over to the nearest cement wall and braced myself against it, resting and breathing deep in an attempt to calm myself. The cement was unnaturally cold against my back. It was summer, so I only had a t-shirt on, but it felt like ice even through that. Again, this observation was primarily made after the fact. In the moment, it just felt good to lean against something. I sat there, waiting for Steve in this underground basement, and I began to feel uneasy. I felt like an idiot for falling down here. I felt the pain from my injuries as well. That all seemed to fade into one emotion in an instant when I heard what I can only identify as breathing, somewhere to my left. I convinced myself that it was my injured mind playing tricks on me for a few moments until my mind decided to rapidly replay Mr. Mays' story. When I first heard it in the classroom years before, I was more impressed than I was scared, but now sitting in a dark basement in the middle of Nebraska, I felt something that I hadn't felt in a long time. It couldn't even be summed up in the word fear. As I sat there, I felt all-encompassing dread. I pointed my flashlight to my left, the direction from which I thought I heard the sound. The light didn't reach any other wall, it was too far away. But I was comforted to see absolutely nothing there. I breathed deeply for a couple more seconds before I heard another noise in the darkness. It was very quick. I cannot be sure whether it wasn't my own body moving around without my noticing, but I thought that I heard a scraping sound not 10 feet in front of me. It sounded like the noise your feet make when you're walking across a dirt-covered floor. Before I could react, I heard the breathing to my left again, closer this time. There was no way this was real. I hadn't seen so much as a spiderweb in this building, and now I was convincing myself that something next to me was breathing? I was angry at myself for getting so worked up. I told myself that the human brain is constantly hallucinating. I told myself that while in silence or darkness, the brain will make sounds to fill the gap, or make you think you see things that aren't there. I channeled my inner skeptic in order to calm myself. It worked. It worked until I saw a flash of something in front of me. I can't be entirely sure what it was, but I heard the accompanying sounds of feet scraping against the floor, and I began to swell with dread. I decided that the best course of action at this point was to turn off my flashlight, assuming that if they couldn't see me, they couldn't get to me, whatever they might be. The bulb of the flashlight faded as it cooled, and I put it into my pocket, simultaneously pushing back against the cold cement wall in an attempt to stand. I managed to get up on my feet, foot, and I found that I couldn't stand to put any pressure on my injured knee. I limped to the cover, humming to myself, trying to break the deafening silence. I called for Steve as loud as I could manage, but I heard no response. He's probably in the back of the car, still hunting for the rope. There had to be a ladder or something somewhere. I continued to hum, and my heartbeat, which had been beating almost out of my chest, slowed to a manageable rate. I moved along the cement wall, keeping my whole body against it, and the weight off my injured knee. I had traveled to what I guessed to be about 10 feet when my head made contact with something in front of me. I tumbled to the ground. My concussion must have amplified the pain because it was blinding. I reached both hands to my forehead when I felt something warm, wet my fingers. I searched for a cut anywhere on my forehead, but I couldn't find one. I desperately searched for my flashlight as I sat up, tried to get back against the wall. I grabbed a light in my right hand, bracing against the wall with the other. I turned it on and pointed it into the darkness where I was just lying. The floor was wet, but the dirt had muddled the color of whatever the liquid was. I tried to get my eyes to focus on the puddle, tried to convince myself that it was my blood when I saw another drop fall into the puddle. Words lack the ability to describe the way I felt when I heard the drip noise again. I saw yet another tiny ball of liquid fall into the puddle. I think I knew, even then, exactly what the source was, but I was endlessly trying to convince myself that I was wrong. I lifted the flashlight up, pointed at the source of the liquid. What stared back at me was a pipe that protruded at least a foot out from the cement wall. The metal was rusted and cracked. Little bits of the liquid began to seep from them. At the end of the pipe was a simple shower head, aimed down towards the ground. You know that feeling when your stomach dropped? In this case, I think mine literally did because I vomited immediately. It got all over my shoe, but that wasn't the least bit important at the time. I ignored the pain in my knee and shuffled along the wall as fast as I possibly could. I heard noises, but couldn't be sure if it was just the sounds of my own movement or something around me. I managed to duck under the next shower head. This one was higher up on the wall and seemed to be leaking out the same liquid that the other one was. I felt like I was having to move along something infinite. Every now and then I would have to duck down or move under another metal bar, another shower head. They began to pour more profusely, but the liquid was too thick to come out easily. The room began to smell. I remembered immediately the way that Mr. Mace had described. I grabbed my shirt and put it over my nose, trucking onward, but it didn't stop to smell for an instant. It smelled like vomit. It smelled like shit. It smelled like burnt air. It smelled like rot. I was still moving against the wall when I fell into some sort of outlet. I hit the dirt ground hard, adrenaline coursing through my veins. The pain still managed to break through, though. My flashlight was still in my hand, and I aimed it and examined my surroundings. Sitting in front of me was a doorway. There was a door there, but it looked aged now. It had a nice little design on it, a doorknob, and a knocker that looked like a snarling demon. Red paint was peeling from it, flaking off and falling to the ground in front of me. I clumsily rose and busted through the door, narrowly missing a piece of hanging sheet metal in front of me. I was crawling now. There was no way I could run. The walls and ceiling were lined with metal, the kind that you would see on the roof of a farm. Large pieces of wood seemed to brace the sheets, holding this makeshift tunnel together. Couldn't risk sliding against that and possibly cutting myself on the metal, or hitting the wood and causing a cave-in, so I crawled. I pulled myself for what felt like miles, running into walls every now and then because the path seemed to curve like a snake. I had no idea where I was in relation to the hole that I had fallen through, but I told myself that there was an exit at the end of this. Had I not been crawling, I would have surely hurt myself far worse. There were parts of the tunnel which the ceiling dipped down maybe 3 feet above the ground. It hadn't caved in because the ceiling still lined it. Someone had built it like this. This, again, is in hindsight. I didn't care at the time. I kept telling myself there was nothing behind me, but I swore that I heard feet scraping only a few inches behind my own. My jeans would brush against my legs every now and then, making it feel like someone was touching me. And even now, I still can't completely convince myself that someone wasn't. I crawled and crawled until I reached an upslope. With joy, I looked ahead of me. There was a cellar door. The door was made of wood. I knew this because I couldn't see light through them. I couldn't be sure, but I thought this must have been the light from the car's headlights. Besides all that, I was just so immensely happy to find an exit. I crawled all the way to the door and threw my shoulder into it. It budged, but it didn't open. I began to scream, but my throat seared with pain. The most I could manage was a harsh crying noise. It sounded like a dying animal. Collapsed in exhaustion and pain, and my eyes staring up at the slits of light before me. I was so close to being out of here, I could taste it. It was in that moment of silent defeat that I heard a noise that was, without question, something moving into the tunnel. It sounded like something was being dragged across the floor. It would move, pause for a second, and then move again. I had nothing left in my stomach to throw up, but I began to gag. I gathered myself slightly and tried to steady my hand enough to focus the flashlight into the tunnel. What I saw, I still could not rationalize. I know what I saw, but I cannot convince myself that it was actually there. I can't stop telling myself I was hallucinating. I saw a child in a dirty sleeping gown. The gown was stained with something dark and brown, with occasional splashes of deep red. The child was extremely frail, like pictures that people might see of a Holocaust victim. I could only make out one eye, brightly reflecting the light of my flashlight in between huge tufts of long dirty hair. The boy or girl, I'm not entirely sure which, moved towards me with difficulty. It wasn't breathing hard, but it seemed that every movement of every muscle took every ounce of strength the child had. The thing that froze me, though, was the eye. It was only visible because it had been reflecting my flashlight, but even in that glint I could feel anger, deep hatred, or something like it. This is the point in which the English language really lacks the right words to explain the situation. I could tell that the child meant me harm. Whether it was a hallucination or not, the thing was getting closer. I started to cry. It was getting closer and closer when I heard a voice from behind me. "Hey Jack," whispered the voice. It was Steve, I was certain. I tried to talk back, fully intending to say, "Open this up and get me out of here right now." However, given my current state, I am sure it just sounded like garbled nonsense. I clawed at the door, pushing against it with everything that I had, finally breaking eye contact with the child. As I did this, the flashlight rolled down the slope, coming to rest somewhere near the child's feet. "What do you see?" the voice asked. "What are you talking about?" I closed my eye. I remember hearing a reply along the lines of, "Just look at it, tell me what you see." But my own screams of frustration drowned it out. I was mumbling like a maniac when the voice told me, calmly, "Rest for a second, I'll get it." The statement took a second to settle in, at which point I closed my eyes tight. "Steve, just do it, please. Please, just get it open, please," I whimpered. "Just get me out of here." My voice was beginning to get louder. "Steve, open the fucking wooden door," I opened my eyes for a split second to see nothing but black hair dangling in front of my face, a small glint of light hidden in the mess of tangle. I slammed my eyes shut, screamed with every ounce of energy I had, "Open the fucking door!" The door behind me gave way, and I fell onto the dirt, taking in a breath of fresh air. My eyes were still closed, but the first thing I did was scramble to find the cellar door and close it. Once I had done that, I took a deep breath and opened my eyes. I saw the barn in front of me illuminated by the headlights of the car. My head was pulsing with pain. I was covered in dirt and liquids that I didn't even care to know the origin of. My knee was, at the very least, dislocated. But despite all of that, I was out of the tunnel. I took a deep breath and buried my head in my hands and said, "Steve, why didn't you just fucking open the door?" I waited for a response, but none came. "Steve, seriously," I began. "I was fucking clawing, screaming for my life," I said as I looked behind me. My stomach must have been on the verge of falling out of me at this point because it shifted again. The only thing behind me was a large mass of bushes that I had seen while examining the perimeter of the building. I was angry. "Steve, this is not the fucking time. Come out of the fucking bushes." I was getting ready to stand out when I heard a yell from the front of the building. Flashlight bobbed up and down in the semi-darkness. Steve was running into the open door of the structure, yelling my name and telling me not to worry. I must have lost consciousness at this point. When I woke up, Steve was standing over me, desperately trying to wake me up. His words were almost incoherent, at least to my ears. He helped me to my feet and began to walk me over to the car. As we walked away, I saw my flashlight sitting just outside the cellar door, and the light was fading. Steve brought me back to the car and then drove me to the nearest hospital. I fell asleep, but he told me that he drove for around an hour before he found a main road. I don't think I ever told him the whole story. I believe he thinks that I was just injured from the fall. He never really asked me about it, and we didn't stay in contact for much longer. It's not like we deliberately parted ways, we just sort of stopped hanging out after that trip and went our separate ways. I've never been able to fully understand what happened that night. There are many things that I can explain away as being hallucinations, but there are still many things that don't make sense. The shower heads were there and they were leaking something. The door was real, the tunnel was real, and most everything else can be semi-rationalized if I convince myself that I had a very bad concussion. Very, very bad concussion. But the one thing I couldn't have imagined was that the cellar door was locked, and then it suddenly wasn't. I'm still as skeptical as I've ever been, but I believe in what happened to me at the showers. I'm not a hermit or a social retard because of this. I drink a lot, but I'm still functional. But I will never return to Nebraska. No one will ever be able to convince me otherwise. I don't watch horror movies either. There's absolutely nothing entertaining about being so desperately scared. That's it, really. There is no typical ending for my story. I was just changed by my experience, yeah. But there is no way to change anything about it or fight back against it. I can't even convince myself I wasn't just seeing things. Believe me, I've been trying for years. Prior to this, there was really no way to find information on the showers. The legend didn't extend outside the classroom of Mr. Mays. No one told stories like this to keep children away from a certain place or to scare them. It just wasn't known. I guess that's really the point of this whole story. I want people to know, firsthand, what this place is like. Maybe it's just a drunk's rationale, or the kid inside me wanting to spread these kinds of stories again. I don't know. I don't care. But it's out there now. People to mold and warp to their needs. And most importantly, it's finally out of my head. It's getting late, and I'm getting another drink. Cheers. Butcherface by user/-32. Fair warning, this will be long. In 1997, my friend, who we'll call Chris, moved across state. At that time, we were 10. We didn't really have much of a way to see each other besides getting a ride by our parents to one of the other's house, which would be a hassle for our parents, so we eventually lost contact. During this time, I had only gotten the chance to visit his house once. With the story being in the subreddit, you'd expect the house to be creepy, but it really wasn't. It was a very plain split-level house probably built in the early 80s with neighbors close by, so it wasn't even secluded. Like I said, we lost contact with each other for 10 years. That is until Chris contacted a mutual friend through MySpace. I didn't have an account on that site. We made plans to hook up and hang out. Now that we have our own means of transportation, it was a lot easier. After maybe a month of this, Chris mentioned that his family would be remodeling the house and I offered my help. Him and his father gladly accepted the offer since the previous owners apparently didn't keep it up by themselves. So a couple weeks later, I drove down one weekend and we started tearing up carpeting, ripping off wallpaper, etc. The basement had been changed into a room for Chris some years before, and while half the floor was concrete, the other half seemed to have been torn up and replaced with floorboards, and one of the boards had become warped and broken, leaving it protruding up under the carpet, so they wanted to replace it. We tore the carpet up and started ripping out floorboards when we found what looked like a hole dug about 5 feet into the ground. Chris jumped down there thinking he could get better leverage to tear up the boards when he said something was down there. His father got a flashlight and we jumped down to check it out. It turned out to be a very worn box. It looked similar to a shoebox, but was about 3 feet long and extremely damaged by the elements. It was so tattered that you wouldn't be able to pick it up in one piece. We believed that whatever was in it would be just as damaged, but when we ripped it open, we noticed that whatever was in it had the added protection of a black trash bag. Chris picked up the trash bag and its contents made the sound of plastic hitting plastic. We were curious as to what's in there, so we brought it upstairs and cut the bag open with a pair of scissors and found 24 unmarked videotapes. Me and Chris were curious as to what was on them, but his father claimed that they were most likely someone's old bootleg collection, and if we're still curious, we should check them out later after we are done for the day. Since the plan was for me to stay the night and help them out the next day and leave that Sunday night, we decided to watch them that night. Since Chris's father was tired and didn't really care what was on the tapes, he went to bed a little early that night. So we pulled their old VCR from their attic and hooked it up to the TV in Chris's room and took one of the tapes out of the bag and slipped it in. The tapes certainly weren't bootlegged movies like Chris's father believed. They were the home movies of some unknown man we eventually began to call Butcherface. There was seemingly no flow from one scene to the next. It was like he would just film something random for what was usually just a couple minutes and then put the camera away for God knows how long until he found something else that interested him. Most of the footage was random footage like him turning on the camera, facing a chair. He would walk out from behind the camera to the chair, push it over onto the floor, then walk back to the camera and turn it off. Or him playing with a random spider, which he would talk to in a low, childlike voice, then end the tape with him squashing it. Or with him just filming down at his feet as he walks while deeply breathing. The one thing that always stuck out about all the footage is that on the few times his face was shown, he was seen wearing what looked like a burlap sack tightly tied around his head with twine, with 2 eye holes cut out. He was also a big guy, being easily over 6 feet tall with a decent build, with some muscles, but not being buff. A lot of the footage was a lot more creepy and sinister. Some of the footage was of him videotaping people leaving buildings and houses. He was obviously hiding somewhere across the street from these locations, and he was often breathing loudly. Even worse were the things that he videotaped himself doing. One piece of footage showed him sitting at a table with a rat wrapped in an empty large pickle jar. He unscrewed the pickle jar, took the rat out, slowly put his hand on its head and started twisting until it stopped screaming. He twisted a little more until its head was completely ripped off the body, and then he turned the camera off. Another clip showed him in a barn, which there was no barn on my friend's property, so we don't know where this was filmed. He turned the camera on and showed a pig tied to a post. He walked over to the pig with an axe in his hand and hacked its head off. What was really creepy was most of this footage was shot in what was now my friend's house. It was always dark in the footage, like this man didn't like to have lights on, but we did recognize various locations of the house. One piece of footage was obviously shot in the living room, which showed Butcherface using a large hunting knife to cut the power cord off something we couldn't see, wrapping this cord tightly around his arm, grunting and moaning as he does it, and using the knife to cut deep cuts into his hand and arm. One disturbing clip showed him standing in front of a table in the kitchen. On the table was a clothes iron. He then unzipped his pants, took out his penis, put it on the table and pressed the hot iron against it. He screamed but didn't take it off for about 30 seconds. He finally took it off, limped over to the camera, and turned it off. What freaked us out the most was a clip of Butcherface in what used to be Chris's upstairs bedroom before he moved to the basement. He turned the camera on and showed the whole room covered in what appeared to be hundreds of lit candles. They were on every table, chair, and shelf. Walls were covered in paintings of grotesque, ghostly faces. He then walked to a corner of the room and started furiously carving something into the floor with a hunting knife. He would stab it into the floor and drag it around, pull it out, and stab again. Since the room was vacant at the moment and used for storage, and was going to be renovated anyway, Chris's father let us tear up the carpet in that area of the room. What we found was a section of the floor that had been heavily sanded down with no real evidence of what had been carved there. Another tape showed Butcherface in that same room, with even more candles. He was on his knees facing away from the camera, with his arms in the chair, screaming to be brought to the pits of pain and torture. One interesting thing about this clip was that he only had 3 fingers on his left hand, missing his pinky and ring finger. He had all 5 fingers on the previous clips, and we think he cut them off. That was the last clip of that tape, and the camera appeared to run out of tape. The last piece of footage on the last tape showed Butcherface furiously digging the hole that we found in the basement. He was digging fast and breathing heavily. He was constantly grunting. His shirt was off, but he still had the mask on. After a couple minutes of him just digging, he started talking, saying something like, "This is it. This is it. They won't know. They'll never find me. This is where I'll hide. Sorry for the long delay. I've been busy with some interesting stuff that I'll actually get into later. Just like the first, this will be long. Back to the story. About 2 weeks after we found the Butcherface tapes, we were getting tired of having to lug the VCR up and down those steep attic steps, because Chris's father for some reason kept asking us to put it back up there when we weren't using it, and when Chris's younger brother, let's call him Evan, was going to college for media production, came into the middle of a conversation about this and mentioned that he could convert the tapes to DVD using equipment at his college. After some haggling and way too much negotiating, that if we, being newly 21 at the time, would pay for the liquor bill for a party friends of Evan's were having, who were 19 at the time, he'd do the next day. When that day came, both me and Chris were waiting anxiously in the kitchen for when Evan got home. When he finally walked in the door an hour later than he said he'd be back, he was looking extremely pale. We asked him if he was done converting and he jumped in our faces saying that we never told him what was on the tapes. Apparently, he didn't actually hear what we were talking about and only heard that we wanted some tapes converted, and he thought they were more like old family recordings, like Christmas or birthday videos. We calmed him down and asked if he converted the tape. He said no, quickly left the room. We were disappointed and started talking about what to do next when Evan came back into the room with his father behind him. After talking about what was on the tapes, Evan retrieved them from his car, and the four of us watched every one of the 24 tapes together. After the last tape was finished, Chris's father's face was just as pale as Evan's was earlier. He leaned back in his chair and said, "That was creepy." An hour of talking that night ended with us wanting to know who was on the tapes. I left for home soon after with the understanding that I would be kept in the loop of what we would do next, which was to figure out the previous owners of the house. A couple of days later, from there, I got a phone call from Chris saying it took them a little while, and they found nothing on the county website, but they found some history in the house at the town library on something called a reverse directory about a previous owner who had it in the mid-80s. After a few unanswered phone calls, we decided to visit these people in person. So that Friday, me, Chris, and his father drove to their house and knocked on the door, only to be greeted by two 80-something-year-old women. Chris's father told them that his family was living in their old house, and asked if we could ask them some questions about it. They refused to let us into their house, but they did tell us about the house. It turned out that both of them were sisters. Their first names were Shirley and Louise, and Louise turned out to be the former owner of the house, but never lived in it. Apparently, her and her husband bought the house and were planning to add some new wiring and plumbing before moving in, but her husband had a severe stroke not too long after buying it and eventually died. With a combination of hospital and funerary bill, Louise couldn't afford fixing up and moving into the house and moved in with their sister instead. But she did mention that during that time, the house was known to be home to a fair number of homeless people who would be regularly chased off the property. We asked if either of them had a son, and they both said no. We were left there with not too many answers. A couple of weeks from there, me and Chris had gone to the movies with his girlfriend. I think he was trying to get his mind off the tapes because I could tell he was still creeped out. We were talking about how much the movie sucked, Spider-Man 3, when Chris slammed on the brakes. We practically skidded about 30 feet and was choked by my seatbelt, and his girlfriend, who wasn't wearing a seatbelt, was almost thrown into the front seat. We started screaming at him, asking him what the hell he was doing. When we looked at what he was staring at and saw a house. It looked familiar to me, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I looked back to Chris and he said, "That house is on the tapes." Then I remembered, one of the houses that Butcherface had watched people come and go from was right there, not 20 feet from us. We knocked on the door, but no one answered, so we decided to come back later. When we got back to Chris's house, I noticed the VCR hooked back up to Chris's TV in his room. I asked him about it, and he said he'd been watching the tapes again for any clues. No wonder why he was still creeped out. That night, when I got home, I got a phone call from Chris. He was whispering and said he thinks he saw someone walking around his backyard. 2 days later, that Friday, I agreed to sleep over and see for myself. Chris was claiming to see glimpses of someone standing or walking around in his backyard, but it was always too dark to see any detail. Both of the previous nights, I was set up to sleep on a couch that was on the now reboarded up hole we first found the tapes in. Very little sleeping actually went on that night because we stayed up in the living room, staring out the sliding glass door to the backyard. We were talking about how we weren't even sure if he actually hurts people when Chris suddenly leans forward and points out the window and said, "See? Right there. Did you see that shadow or something?" I jumped up and flipped the switch to the deck lights, but they didn't go on. So we got flashlights and went out to look. Besides some tree branches blowing in the wind, we found nothing. At around 4 a.m., we decided to get some sleep. I only stayed on the couch for a couple of hours because I got too cold because I felt a draft that I think was coming between the boards on the floor. I went home the next afternoon thinking the night before was a dud until I got a frantic phone call that night. Someone had broken into Chris's house while they were out. The sliding glass door to the backyard was completely smashed, with broken glass having been thrown all the way across the living room and into the dining room. I drove back there because they wanted me as a witness, seeing a shadow in the backyard. They showed me around and I saw that this person had completely tossed the living room, dining room, and kitchen. In the bathroom, the mirror all over the medicine cabinet had been smashed and all the meds in the medicine cabinet were missing. Something else was missing, which was a lot more disconcerting. 4 knives had been removed from the knife holder in the kitchen. I stayed there for about an hour and decided to go home, only until after I left that I realized the Butcherface tape was never mentioned to the cops. A little while after I got home, I got another call from Chris, saying they had found the missing knives under the blankets of each family member's bed. That weekend, Chris and his father decided to look around the house more thoroughly, to see if Butcherface had left any other clues to his former presence in the house. I came over to help, and the only room they've never thoroughly looked around in since getting the house was the attic, so we decided to start there. It didn't take long to find anything because almost immediately I came across an old-looking trash bag in one of the corners. I picked it up and heard the tinking sound of glass against glass. We brought it downstairs and cut it open, found it completely full of liquor bottles and used syringes. Using rubber gloves, we removed every object one at a time. It was almost all bottles and syringes and occasional trash, until we got to the bottom. At the bottom of the bag, we found a shoebox. It was stained and worn. Couldn't even see the brand of shoe that used to be in it. We carefully took it out and removed the top, which seemed to have been glued closed. Inside was a series of papers and photos. The photos were pretty disturbing. One was a close-up of a hand covered in pins. Those ones with the long point, tiny ball of colored plastic at one end. There were so many of them that it looked like a porcupine. Another one had a, presumably, dead dog lying on the ground. All we could really see of its surroundings was the dirt of the ground. Behind it was too dark. We assumed it was dead because it was missing half its face. The flesh of the side of the face that was facing the camera was gone, making it look like it was smiling with a lidless eye. There were a lot more pictures, including a cow with blood on its mouth, a very pale-looking foot, various 70s and 80s era toys, a collection of knives, a hand and arm painted multiple colors like patchwork, and a close-up of an eyeball. The papers were pretty freaky as well. They were a combination of drawings and writings. Most of the writings were what seemed like a wish list of murder, listing practically every way imaginable how to kill people. Others seemed to be random thoughts, like how he accidentally pissed his pants while at the movie, or how he has an infectious evil, and that he'll spread these to his disciples. Some of the drawings were pretty similar to the ones seen on the tapes of the walls of Chris's old room. Others were more detailed and showed corpses of various states of decay and strange creatures. They were humanoid, but they all had a demonic look to them, with many of them shown standing on all fours. One thing that showed up often was a strange symbol. It looked like the letter C, with the gap in the C pointing down, with a V laid on top. When we got to the bottom of the box, we found another tape, one that we'll never get to watch because it was completely coated in candle wax. Running out of clues, we decided to revisit the old woman who owned the house in the 80s again. It had been almost 2 months since we last visited them. We grew to realize that their story didn't quite make sense. For instance, Louise claimed to have given up on the house, yet the tapes we could see that the house had power. Why would she have continued paying the power bill if she didn't want the house? They also mentioned that the homeless people had been regularly arrested or chased off the property by the cops, but we found no records of this. We tried calling them, but just like last time, we got no answer. So we decided to drop by again. When we got there, we found the house abandoned. We went next door and asked the neighbor if they knew where the 2 old ladies that lived next door had gone. They told us that Louise had died, but they didn't know how. About 3 weeks earlier, and Shirley abruptly packed up and moved away a week later. While Chris's father was talking to the neighbor, Chris pulled me aside and whispered, "We're breaking into that house." That night, we waited until it was late, drove to the old lady's former house. We had never broken into a house before in our lives. We were dressed in the stereotypical burglar outfit, black shirt and pants and a black hockey mask. I know, stupid. When we got to the house, we were so nervous that we didn't even leave the car for a good 45 minutes. When we felt assured that the neighborhood was asleep, we got out of the car and crept into the backyard and to the back door. We looked into the window on the door, but it was too dark to see anything. I took my shirt off and put it up against the window and gave it a punch, breaking the glass. It felt surprisingly loud, but that could have just been because it was so quiet, and the neighbors never woke up, so I guess it really wasn't that loud. I reached in the hole in the glass and unlatched the door, then we had a whispered fight over who will go in first. It actually got down to a game of rock, paper, scissors, which I won. We crept in and hunched over and I closed the door behind me, accidentally slamming it, giving Chris a good jump that we couldn't help laughing over. We snuck around the house with our flashlights shining over the walls. As a side note, I really don't see how much they really would have fixed up Chris's house when they had it, because this one looked like crap. The wallpaper was probably older than me and Chris combined. But anyway, we went into the living room and found a huge pile of trash lying in the far corner with a depression in the middle, like a person or a large dog had used it as a bed. We went upstairs and found something that connected this house to Chris's. In one of the bedrooms was a pile of pill bottles. Some of the pill bottles were the ones stolen from Chris's bathroom medicine cabinet. We knew this because some of them had his mother and father's name on them, and one of them was Chris's back pain medicine from an injury that happened a couple years ago that will require surgery. This is all that we needed to see, so we booked it back down the stairs to the door. But when we got to the door, I jumped back, knocking both me and Chris down. On the inside of the back door was a CV symbol from Butcherface's notes. After we got back into the car, Chris said something that creeped both of us out. Butcherface was really living in that house. Probably wasn't there because he was staking out Chris's house right now. Later that week, I visited Chris's house again, and as soon as I walked into the door, I knew I walked into an air of distress. Chris's mother and brother were pacing back and forth in the living room, looking out the window into the backyard. I walked in and asked what was going on, but looked out the window, saw Chris and his father in the backyard screaming at each other, and behind them was a large bonfire that was almost nothing more than cinders. Chris's mother said their dog, Bracket, had gone missing, but didn't say anything else. I opened the now replaced sliding glass door and walked out to meet them. As soon as Chris's father saw me, he became even angrier. Chris met me halfway to the fire and said I had to tell them that we broke into that house. I asked why, and he said that he thinks that Butcherface took their dog as payback for breaking into his home. I asked what was on the fire, and Chris told me that what his father was burning was Butcherface's notes, photos, and tapes. Everything had been burned to ashes. During this, his father walked up behind him and said, "I'm ending this right now. I'm burning everything so you guys can't get into any more trouble." As he said this, he continued past us into the back door of his garage, came back with a shovel, adding, "And I'm burying the ashes to put this to rest for good," and started digging a hole at the back of his yard close to the wood. Chris pulled me back into the house and started talking about how all of this was unfair. How could his father just burn the tapes like that they were so close to figuring out who Butcherface was, etc. Then his mother called us from upstairs. We came up and she pointed out the door to his father, who had stopped digging and was looking into the hole he had dug so far. We walked outside and crossed the yard to the hole his father was still looking into. When we got to it, we realized why he was frozen there, because just a couple feet into the hole was, after more digging, turned out to be over 30 skeletons of cats, dogs, other animals. This is when we started calling him Butcherface. Alright, here's the final chapter. It will also be long. After Chris's father burned Butcherface's media, including the art, photos, and tapes, I think everyone, including me, had hoped that Chris would let it go. I know I was willing to let it go, but it wasn't long after that Chris began looking for any evidence of other media by Butcherface. He would occasionally talk, just to me, about strange tapes and art found in other parts of the country, but most of it seemed sketchy, which even Chris was completely willing to admit. My attitude began to change about looking into Butcherface, and around this time I was sitting at my desk and caught myself absent-mindedly drawing Butcherface's CV symbol on a piece of paper I was supposed to be drawing Batman on, which is a different story altogether. Roughly 2 weeks after Chris's dog disappeared and his father burned all evidence of Butcherface, Chris showed up on my doorstep saying he wanted to go back to the house we found that was on the tapes. When we first found it, no one was home, in part 2. We showed up at the house around 6 p.m. on a Wednesday hoping that anybody living there would be home from work. We went to the door and knocked, and the person who answered the door was a man roughly in his 50s. It turns out that he did actually live in the house in the mid-80s, when we believed the tapes were shot. We told him about the tapes and how his house was on them, and he asked if anything strange had happened around that time. He said that they had nothing like what was on the tapes, but there was a point when they realized something had been living in their shed in the backyard. The shed had since been torn down, but he did remember that there was a carving left on the doorframe. We asked him what it was, and he pulled out a pad of paper and drew the CV symbol. The very next day, Chris's mother was walking around in their backyard and came across their dog. He'd been ripped open from the neck to the stomach and placed in the still open hole his father had dug 2 weeks earlier. The cops had been called, and they were finally told about Butcherface. Since Chris's father had burned everything, they really had no evidence that the dog had been killed by a person and labeled it an animal mauling. It wasn't long after that I came home to find my front door open. I walked up the front steps and saw that the door was swung open, only hanging on one hinge. It being dark out, I flipped this light switch just inside the door and it didn't come on. I went around the house to the shed in the backyard and grabbed the most menacing thing I could that was near the door, which was a pitchfork. Going back to the front door, I pulled out my cell phone and called 911. After making the call, I cautiously entered the house, making sure the pitchfork was in front of me. I crept up the stairs and got to the nearest light switch and flipped it. But this one wasn't working either. I came to the conclusion that the power was cut. Using my cell phone as a flashlight, I got a look at the damage done. The leather couch had been slashed open with many cuts and filling being pulled out, and the glass doors on the kitchen cabinets had been smashed. More than half of the liquor bottles in the liquor cabinet were missing, and the medicine in the medicine cabinet was gone. It all seemed very familiar. I mean, even my 13-year-old dog's arthritis pills were taken. Speaking of the dog, Drake, he has an anxiety problem, so we keep him in a crate whenever we leave the house. Thinking of what happened to Chris's dog, I ran down the hall to the office where the crate was kept. I shined what little light I had from my phone on the crate and saw its door open, and it looked empty. I stepped forward afraid of what I'd see, and shone the light into the crate, and saw Drake cowering in the back, whimpering. That's when the cops pulled up. My family came home soon afterwards. When the cops had asked us if we had any enemies, since the house mostly just seemed to be tossed, I had to tell them about Butcherface. While the cops were looking around, they noticed that the power hadn't been cut. It turned out that every single bulb in the house had been partially unscrewed, leaving the light bulb in the socket but not able to light up. It was the first time my family had heard about Butcherface, and they asked me to stop seeing Chris. I hadn't so much as talked to Chris on the phone for almost 2 months after that. Very little had happened in that time, but something still didn't feel right as well. For one thing, my sister, who works nights, started asking me to stand at the front door and wait until she got in her car whenever she left, since she leaves after dark. I asked a couple times why, but she never gave an answer. It's like she just felt creeped out or that she was being watched whenever she went outside. Our dog seemed to be spooked too. Whenever we tie him outside, he'd only do his business and come right back in, which is very out of character for him. One day, I was standing at my back door, looking into the backyard, thinking of all this when my eyes locked onto the shed in the backyard, and I remembered the story told to us by the people we talked to whose house we saw in the tapes. They found evidence of someone living in their shed. I went to my room and picked a sword from my sword collection, yeah, I'm a nerd, and went out to the shed. I crossed the yard, and when I got to the shed, I found it unlocked. I opened the door and looked inside, only using the sunlight since there is no power running to it. I immediately saw a pile of trash in the far corner. It was a loose pile of tarps, cloth from umbrellas, and trash bags, and had a compression in the middle like someone had been lying on it. Off to the side of the pile was the missing liquor bottles from inside the house and some garbage. This guy had been living in the shed, and it was a good chance that he had been there since the house was broken into 2 months ago. In fact, for all I know, he could have been in there that night when I went to the shed for the pitchfork, watching me. I didn't want to freak out my family, so I cleaned it up in secret. At the bottom of the bedding of trash, I found a ratty notebook. I only half opened it up to a random page, saw some very familiar artwork, and immediately closed it, tore it up, and threw it in the trash. A couple weeks later, I got a phone call from Chris. He said he was still doing some looking around and found some strange stuff. Before I could say that I didn't want to hear it, he said he went back to the house of the women who were the former owners of the house that we had talked to before. Before I could respond to this, he said, "They lied. Come see me tomorrow." The next day, without telling my family, I drove back to Chris's house. When I got there, I was greeted by his mother, who seemed to be in a good mood. I asked her how it was going, knowing what I was talking about, and she said nothing strange had happened there for a couple months. I asked where Chris was, and she pointed to the stairs that led down to his basement bedroom. I opened the door and immediately heard Chris talking, but I couldn't quite hear what he was saying, but I assumed he was talking to his girlfriend. When I got to a point on the stairs that I could see into his room, I saw that he was sitting in front of his desk talking to a video camera. I asked him what the hell he was doing, and he smiled and said, "Nothing," and turned off the camera and slid it back between his monitor and computer tower like it wasn't strange that he was talking to a camera, just like Butcherface did. By this time, I had gotten to the bottom of the stairs, and Chris stood from his chair and immediately changed the subject. He walked up to me and started talking about how, a couple days before, he drove to the house of the old women who used to own this house. When he got there, he parked across the street and waited. He knew that the former owner of the house, Louise, had died, and that her sister, Shirley, moved away soon after, and that someone had been living in the house since then. He was hoping to see Butcherface either entering or leaving the house. Instead, he saw Shirley pull into the driveway. They got out of their cars at the same time. Shirley apparently didn't see Chris because she just continued to the house. By the time he caught up to her, she had already gone into the house, but then she began to back out, apparently shocked at something she saw in there. When he got to her, she was already back on the porch. He started talking to her, and she eventually told him what she really knew about Butcherface. Like we already knew, she started with when her sister Louise and her husband bought the house, and they wanted to replace the wiring and plumbing, but before that could happen, Louise's husband got sick and eventually died. This is where they left the story off before. What they didn't tell us is that a couple years after her husband's death, Louise still couldn't afford paying for it, so she decided to sell it instead. After it just sitting there for not too long, they thought it would be a relatively easy fix, so they, in their early 60s at the time, decided to fix it up themselves. When they arrived to check out the house for the first time, they found the house like it looks in the videos. Garbage everywhere and drawings on the walls with burnt out candles everywhere and a hole in the basement. They began to clean it up, picking up the garbage, putting up cheap wallpaper, and putting down carpeting, and boarding up the hole in the basement as best they could. The one thing she did mention that we never noticed is that she said in the hole in the basement there was another hole in the cinder block wall of the foundation that led to the backyard. They bricked up the hole, but due to their budget, and she apparently also blamed their old age, they never used any mortar. They just laid the bricks in place and left it at that. Chris asked her if they put any videos in the hole and she outright refused. We determined that if anyone knew where the hole was, they could just remove the cinder blocks and get into the hole and do whatever they wanted there, like hiding some tapes. We went out to his backyard to see if this was true, and we did indeed find a patch of the cinder block wall where you could remove the blocks. They seemed to have some fresh scrape marks like they had been recently moved, but we couldn't be sure. Chris's and Louise's conversation continued with her telling them that while cleaning out the kitchen they found a rectangular object wrapped in tin foil. They unwrapped it and found a videotape. They brought it back home and popped it in their VCR and watched it. Apparently there was no picture. The screen was just black, like he left a lens cap on or something. But it seemed to be intentional because what it lacked in visuals, it compensated with sound. He said she described it as rants and strange noises for the entire tape. He said she then ended their conversation and quickly walked back to her car, leaving her old house's door open, and drove away. Chris then abruptly changed the subject by jumping back to his desk and pulling a folder out of a drawer and opening it up. The papers inside were printouts of various disconnected websites showing pictures of stills from videotapes, drawings, photos, and carvings that all looked familiar. He said, "Look, they're from all over the country, including some bits of Mexico and Canada. Some of these apparently even appear in some places of Europe. It's like he's traveling around and leaving this stuff wherever he can." Chris then said that he will continue his investigation into Butcherface. That investigation continued for 4 years, until last weekend. This is why I was gone for 3 days after writing part 1. I hate to make this sound cliched, but Chris became pretty obsessed with trying to find out who Butcherface was. His investigation was slow, finding the occasional picture or video. He even traveled to a town near Denver, Colorado because he believed he found what he called a nest, a place where Butcherface seemed to appear often, much like around our area, but he didn't find much. We were never really sure what was fueling Chris's interest in Butcherface since he had no more of Butcherface's media anymore since his father burned it all. Then last week, we found where it was all coming from. I had come by because we were planning to see Transformers 3, but we never got to go. I pulled into his driveway at the same time as his girlfriend. We both got out of our cars and laughed at the coincidence of both of us getting there at the same time and walked into his house. His family was working, so we just walked into the house and down the stairs to his room. We hung out for a little while, and Chris and his girlfriend sitting on his bed with me sitting at the desk. We were chit-chatting, and I was spinning the chair I was in and happened to notice a tape leaning against the speaker to his computer. I picked up the tape and asked him what it was. He immediately got an "ouch" look on his face. When his girlfriend got into the questioning, he finally broke down and admitted that it was the tape the old ladies had found in the house in the 80s. He said that when he talked to Shirley that time in front of her house where she told him they found the tape, she also gave the tape to him, and he chose to leave that part out of the story 4 years ago. This is when we knew he had a problem. We asked him to stop listening to the tape. We asked him to stop the search for Butcherface. It has never led to anything good. So that next week, that is to say, this week, we decided to go to a cabin that Chris's girlfriend's family owns on a lake a couple towns over to finally finish it. We didn't know how right we were. We arrived at the cabin in the afternoon of Monday. It was me, Chris, his girlfriend, and our friend Jesse, who is the mutual friend mentioned in part 1. We filled Jesse in on the whole Butcherface story as we knew it on the drive down, and he immediately regretted coming along. Chris brought everything he had on Butcherface, and soon after we got there, he asked if we could watch the last tape one final time. Jesse wanted to see what the fuss was about, and I must admit I was curious to check it out myself. The cabin had no cable, no phone line, no cell phone signal, no internet access, and so the only form of entertainment was to watch movies, so they actually had a VCR still there with a decent VHS collection. We popped the tape into the VCR and turned it on. As mentioned before, this tape had nothing visual and was all audio. It began clicking with sounds like from an insect that would start off slow and then go faster, then slow down and go fast again. It then changed to a quiet talking like a whisper. The voice talked about how he had an infectious evil and wanted to spread it to his disciples, and then it just faded out like he just walked away from the camera. There were more noises of what sounded like animals walking around the inside of a building and a high screeching noise that lasted for a good 5 minutes. There was more talking where he called people zombies and cows, and how only a few were worthy for the pit, following by a jabbering like he was humming while wiggling his tongue around. That night, we lit a bonfire and Chris burned every note, picture, schematic, and the last tape he had about Butcherface. The next day, we spent most of the morning watching movies, regular movies, and then we went out on a rowboat and explored the lake for a couple hours. When we got back, we hung out on the shore with some drinks. I must admit, it reminded me of that time I walked into Chris's house and met his mother. She was in such a good mood after not having any problems with Butcherface anymore. It felt almost exactly like that. At one point, Chris's girlfriend came out and asked us if anyone knew where her iPod was. She claimed that she left it in his docking bay, one of those ones with the speakers, which was also missing. She kept accusing us of hiding it from her. At this point, it was starting to get dark and we began going back to the cabin one by one. I was the last one, and I must admit I didn't close the door. Me, Chris, and his girlfriend were in their room looking for the iPod in its docking station, but Jesse, who was still out in the living room, yelled, "Holy f!" We ran out into the living room, and he said he just saw a person run by the open door outside on all fours. Chris's girlfriend rushed to the door and slammed it shut and locked it. We stood still listening for where this person could have gone when all of a sudden, we started hearing loud noises coming from the front deck. It was random noises like a voice chattering, something like the grinding of a buzzsaw, sobbing, all in quick succession. We rushed to the door and peeked out the small window and saw Chris's girlfriend's iPod sitting on its docking bay with a power cord going from it to a plug on the outside wall, sitting on the railing to the deck. These sounds were coming from the iPod. Chris opened the door, ran out and grabbed the iPod off the docking bay and ran back to the cabin. He gave it to his girlfriend and told her to delete the file that it was playing, effectively erasing every known piece of media we knew of by Butcherface. Me and Chris then ran to the door, opened it, and yelled that there was nothing left of any of his media that we had. We destroyed every connection we had to him, and he had no reason to follow us anymore. I stayed quiet for the rest of the night, and we left that morning. During the drive home, we started thinking of some things. We now believe that Butcherface wanted us to find those tapes. Maybe not us per se, but someone. That day, we found those first 24 tapes. We started an avalanche of more and more of his media to be surfaced and helped the possibility of it spreading to others. He had mentioned more than once in his media that he wanted to spread his infectious evil only to his disciples, and we think that those disciples are those who have seen his media. We say this because he never seems to attempt to hide it and seems to keep watch of all those who have seen it. In the notes I saw of Chris's before he burned them, I saw that many of the sightings of him were scary, but never seemed to be completely dangerous. It was like he was just keeping watch over those who have experienced his media. I attempted not writing out parts 2 and 3 of the story because I'm not sure if this counts as spreading his media. Ultimately, I decided to finish it to warn you that if you ever come across anything that even resembles the footage, audio, art, writings, or carvings that are described in these stories, do not look at them. When we got back home, Chris decided to tell his family everything that had happened, including the tape he had hidden from everyone else and our hypothesis as to who Butcherface is and what he's doing. Chris's brother Evan's face became pale, just as pale as the day he first saw the tapes. We asked what the matter was, and he said, "You know how I said I never converted the tape to DVDs? Well, I lied." Apparently, he actually did do the conversion at his college after the day their house was broken into. The thing is, they disappeared, and he later learned that fellow students had taken them, thinking it was a cool school project, and made copies. From what we've heard, they've been handed down from person to person and copied, leading to countless duplicates.